Good evening and welcome to The Report with me, John Rees. US President Barack Obama has unveiled a new global strategy to mobilise the international community against the Islamic State, the group which still controls a huge swathe of areas in Syria and Iraq. Nazli Tazi has more on this story.
It will take time to eradicate a cancer like ISIL. And any time we take military action, there are risks involved, especially to the servicemen and women who carry out these missions.
In a nationally televised speech, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, detailed plans of a new comprehensive terror strategy intended to roll back the terrorist threat resulting from the Islamic State group's rapid military expansion across Syria and Iraq. Obama's plan detailed four principal objectives: a systematic campaign of airstrikes against IS targets, providing greater support to partner forces battling IS with the exception of President of Syria Bashar al-Assad, the extension of counter-terrorism efforts to quench the group's funding, and continuing to deliver foreign aid to civilians affected by the group's ongoing conquest. The intensification of Obama's fight has seen America coalition building, with Iraq's newly formed government and other partner forces fighting on the front lines in the areas infiltrated by IS. Seeking to expose IS's manipulation of sectarian strife in Iraq and the civil war in Syria, Obama rejected its self-proclaimed status as a state and vowed to extend airstrikes into Syria, where the group controls the northern half of the country. These announcements come a year after Obama failed to acquire congressional approval for airstrikes in Syria at the time of the chemical massacre allegedly carried out by regime forces in eastern Ghouta that claimed the lives of over 1,000 Syrians. Obama's new deliberations, some analysts suggest, could present to Bashar al-Assad the time needed to launch a full-scale attack against opponents and ordinary civilians, as IS remains the central fear occupying people's minds.
Syria now. We're taking some steps in Iraq, but he should be in Syria as well, because that's where they're based out of. We sat back, we've let them get a foothold, and, you know, people who are worried more than us are the other Middle East countries, because you've got Muslims killing Muslims, beheading Christians. I mean, why wouldn't we pay attention to that?
Meanwhile, Syria's main Western-backed oppositional group commended Obama's latest speech and welcomed the authorization of airstrikes and urged the US Congress to act fast in providing training to Syrian rebels fighting a dual battle against both IS and President Bashar. The coalition stated it stands ready and willing to partner with the international community to defeat both. As coalition building takes centre stage in Obama's plan to confront the IS group, a broad range of countries within and outside of the Middle East have begun to mobilise against them. 3 days prior to Obama's address, talks between US Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel and Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan commenced and focused on the necessity of strategic orientation in the fight against IS through the establishment of a US-led coalition. But as fears of the threat IS poses continue unabated, will America's plan successfully bridge the gap between warring factions seeking their own interests whilst committing to decimate IS? Nazli Tazi, The Report.
Well, in the studio to discuss all this, we're joined by Sabah Al-Muhktar, President of the Arab Lawyers Association. On the phone, we're joined by Professor Eric Grove, Defence Analyst and Senior Fellow at Liverpool Hope University. Welcome to the programme. Sabah, has this got any chance of working, or is it likely simply to fragment ISIS and produce even more terror groups?
I have a problem with the it, because President Obama didn't say anything really. He was high on rhetoric. He had no specific plans. This idea that we are all against it, yes, we are all against it. A coalition by whom, with what, to fight who? This is, again, one of these, it worries me that we are again going into this idea of war on terror, which has no limit, which has no time, which has no target. And everybody can interpret it the way they want. Bashar al-Assad is going to continue to kill the Syrians on the basis he's fighting ISIS. Maliki will continue to kill the Iraqis on the basis he's killing ISIS. And the Americans know very well that terrorism cannot be fought from the air. This is a non-starter. They're going to have these diplomatic meetings and they're going to supply some arms. Yes, but coalition, world community, I don't know what they're talking about. When you have the...
Well, just let me stop you there and bring in Professor Grove, because that's a pretty damning assessment of what President Obama did, or perhaps more importantly, didn't say. What do you think?
Well, it strikes me the major weakness in what Obama said was that he has, I think, the illusion that there is in the Free Syria Army, as was, a bunch of sort of liberal Syrians who want to set up some kind of liberal democratic regime. All the evidence seems to be that the FSA, which did contain some pretty unpleasant elements, which is why some people turn to the jihadis, is pretty weak. It suffered some very serious defeats. And if we are going to get a coalition, it might well be, which is something like an ultimate irony, the Saudis and the Gulf state friends, who are jihadis but not the same jihadis as the Islamic State, turning on the Islamic State. So we have a sort of intra-jihadi Islamist civil war, because there is strong evidence that, in fact, in the past, Saudis, if not the Saudi government, and people in the Gulf states have actually been major backers of the Islamic State. Now, Obama specifically ruled out an alliance that would be at least equally politically embarrassing with the Assad government. But of course, if we do strike at the Islamic State, which has emerged as the most effective anti-Assad force, we are effectively siding with Assad. And I think there would be difficulty carrying out airstrikes unless they weren't at least cleared with the Assad government, because the Assad government, weaker though it is than it used to be, has still got quite powerful air defences.
Well, that's an interesting point, Sabah, that whether or not there was a formal agreement with Assad, the airstrikes couldn't take place without his tacit consent because of the air defences that the Syrian regime has. So we're in the remarkable situation that just a year ago, the Parliament in this country, the Congress in the United States, were being asked to vote in favour of an attack on Assad. Now we're being asked to support an attack on his opponents, from which he will inevitably benefit and may be tacitly involved.
Well, this is the situation you have. You're supporting. Effectively, we are supporting ISIS in Syria because we want to uphold the regime, and we are fighting ISIS in Iraq because we want to get rid of it. I think the idea that somehow ISIS has become such a huge international threat I think it's an exaggerated one. The problem you have, we are addressing the symptoms rather than the cause. Obama has advised the Iraqi government that they must have an inclusive government. They are not having an inclusive government. At the end of the day, you will have the people of the region who are in the ISIS land, if you like, are not going to fight ISIS. They have ISIS is better for them than the government of Maliki, and the same thing in Syria. So people are not going to fight that one. The idea that we can bring in Kuwaiti soldiers or Saudi soldiers or whatever other Turks or something, I don't think it's realistic. I don't think anybody is calling on the US or the UK to send its troops, and probably they will not send troops. Using the Air Force is not going to do anything. Issuing UN Security Council resolutions, I was wondering, what are they going to do? They're going to serve it on Al-Khalifa Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, serve him with a UN Security Council resolution that he's a terrorist? But this somehow seems to be, it's gone out of control. You have NATO, you have the Security Council, you have a very high state of alert, but nobody is actually addressing the problem. The ISIS is, you don't send an F-16 to bomb a car with 3 terrorists on it. And at the end of the day, as long as they don't wrap their face and they don't carry the black flag, you don't know who ISIS is.
Professor Grove, what do you make of Turkey's role in all this? Because it still seems to be the case that ISIS can export oil in tankers over the Turkish border to fund their activities. This is a NATO member. What do you think their role is likely to be in all this? Well,
Turkey's role has been to undermine Assad by supporting anybody who is against him. And as you say, they've helped the Islamic State with their exports, etc. And the open border that has existed has been absolutely key in the growth of jihadi movements. I mean, one wonders sometimes about Erdogan's sympathies, with those kind of movements, rather than with the Assad regime. And I think Turkey is absolutely crucial. Now, if Turkey can be persuaded, because of American pressure, to form a kind of anti-Islamic State Muslim alliance, if you see what I mean, which would have to be. I mean, I don't see the Free Syrian Army as being anything other than, as we say, a busted flush, actually.
Well, just let me ask you about that, because that's an interesting question, because, the Free Syrian Army have been, popular with the Americans, unpopular with the Americans, and they seem to be popular. Again, the one thing that they don't seem to have is a sufficient base inside Syria to make a difference. In fact, stories are now that some of their members are defecting to the Islamic State because they're more effective. How do you read that?
Yes. I mean, I think that is the problem. I think some people have gone off to fight with the FSA and been rather disappointed. I mean, there are some rather disturbing stories that just as the Friends of the West in Afghanistan, because of their activities, their brigandage activities, sort of encourage people to go over to the Taliban, so activities by some, at least, Free Syrian Army forces have encouraged people to go over to the Islamic State. So I think that these are very murky waters indeed, and I think the only way you're going to get Turkish and Saudi and Gulf support for an anti-Islamic State movement is actually by mobilizing jihadis. I think the West is faced with the choice of, do we support Assad or do we support Al-Nusra Front and other Saudi-backed and other people's-backed jihadi forces?
Okay, well, let me bring that back to the studio, Professor Grove. Sabah, so I mean, I don't know whether you share that assessment of the FSA, but if you do, it seems to me that one of the groups of people that we're left with who are effective on the ground, and you yourself made the point that it can't simply be an air campaign, are the PKK. But they're the one section of the Kurds which the Americans don't like. They like the section that's been least effective against ISIS. Is that true, would you say?
Yeah, I think so. But I think what we are forgetting is really ISIS can only be fought by the people who are in ISIS land. That is in western of Iraq and northern Iraq. And those people will only stand against ISIS, as they did before in the past, when they were treated better. Because at the present moment, when the regime, both Maliki and Assad, are accusing everybody of being in ISIS, people who are there will never fight against ISIS because they are protecting them from the more evil, from the worse evil. So the only way we can get this done is to put pressure on the government, at least in Iraq, that they must have an inclusive government. They treat people not as ISIS, but as Iraqis who are revolting against the regime. Those people will be the ones who will get rid of ISIS because they are the ones who are actually paying the price to ISIS. It's not David Cameron or Obama. Those people are worried about the nations, quite rightly so, but they're not the ones who are paying the price. The Iraqis and the Syrians are the ones who are paying the price now. But if we continue to accuse them of being ISIS, then they have no reason to fight.
Yeah. Professor Grove, do you think that one of the ways, and I think this is the point that without putting words in his mouth, that Sabah is suggesting here, is that if the bombing strategy ends up gluing ISIS and the Sunni rebellion more closely together, we'll never get a settlement because a sensible policy would be to try and pull them apart.
I think that's absolutely true, and I think there are strong. Now Maliki has actually gone himself, and we have a newer government which has been cobbled together. I agree with that, but I mean it does appear to be something of a coalition between Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds. I mean, if we can get that government to encourage, possibly by offers of federalism, etc., or a much more devolved government to the Sunnis of the Sunni areas, then I think we might be able to prize apart the Sunni tribes from IS. I mean, IS are very effective in using terror and propaganda, and if the choice is between, perhaps despite that or because of it, the Islamic State and the Shia militias. I mean, there's a great deal of suspicion, quite rightly, in the Sunni areas about the activities of the Shia militias, who have done some pretty nasty, if not so well-publicized things. And I can quite understand why a young Sunni in the Islamic State area might see the IS as the lesser of the two evils. If the sheer terror of the Islamic State becomes counterproductive, as I suspect it might in many circumstances, then there is a chance for the new Iraqi government, with air support from the West, to carry it out carefully and accurately without too much collateral damage, if that's possible. Then you might be able to get some kind of counterattack.
OK. Well, I'm afraid that's where we're going to have to leave that part of the discussion because we're moving towards our first break of the evening. But do join us in part 2 when we'll be looking at the rest of today's news. Welcome back to the report. The release of 45 UN peacekeepers taken prisoner on the Golan Heights by Al-Qaeda affiliate the Al-Nusra Front has just been announced this morning. With more on this and the rest of today's news, here's Yasmin Khatun.
Syrian rebel group the Nusra Front have released 45 Fijian soldiers whom they captured in the Golan Heights.
It is a very happy day that we've been informed that we will be released.
The 45 men working as United Nations peacekeepers were taken from their post in August. The Nusra Front had demanded compensation for fighters who had been killed, humanitarian assistance for its supporters, and its removal from the United Nations list of terrorist organisations. Qatar, thought to have influence over the group, said Fiji had formally requested its assistance in freeing the hostages. The Bureau of Immigration in the Philippines has blacklisted and recommended the deportation of Canadian Islamic teacher Bilal Phillips, who has been arrested for alleged terrorist links. Phillips has written, translated and commented in over 50 published books on various Islamic topics and presented Islamic programming for a number of years on various TV channels. The Indian Army have organised medical camps to assist flood-affected people as waters begin to recede. Rescue teams aim to evacuate thousands of villagers who have been left stranded by the heaviest rainfall to hit Kashmir in 50 years. On the Indian side of the disputed region, floods and landslides have cut off more than 1 million people from basic services. The flooding is the first major humanitarian emergency under Prime Minister Narendra Modi and also comes at a difficult time for Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. Sharif has faced weeks of street protests aimed at forcing him out. Shia Houthi rebels have clashed with government forces in the Sana'a suburb as weeks of protests continue. Houthi protesters have been camping outside state institutions in a campaign to bring down the government and secure greater representation. At least 7 civilians have already been killed as violent clashes continue. Yemeni authorities have said police would exercise restraint to avoid further escalating tensions, while the Houthi group said its supporters will continue peaceful demonstrations to overthrow the government. "13 years on from the infamous attacks on the United States, a ceremony will take place at the World Trade Center to commemorate the loss of life. Almost 3,000 people lost their lives in the assault carried out by 19 hijackers. The attack, to which Al-Qaeda claimed credit, led to the subsequent war on terror. The United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom on the 7th of October 2001 in a hunt for deceased Al-Qaeda chief Osama bin Laden. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 was also a subsequent result.
Well, Sabah Al-Muhktar is still here, and we're going to discuss some of those items on the news then. So, Sabah, first of all, the incident on the Golan Heights. What is this telling us about the situation, the intervention of the Qataris, for instance? That's an interesting point, isn't it?
Well, the Qataris has been acting as go-between whenever, whether even on the war on terror, on Iraq, on Afghanistan, and indeed in the situation on Palestine. They have been willing to do the dirty work for others. They have never worked alone. They are always working at the behest or on behalf of the whatever Western power. The release of those soldiers, it is absolutely correct to be done. What price was paid is another matter. Then we talk about we are trying to drive the financial support for the Qaeda and Ital and its associates, and yet we have to go and do the deals, because I'm sure there was a deal for those people to be released, and I think it's quite rightly so to be done so.
Professor Grove, what do you think about this? Do you think that this is perhaps related to the point that you were making in the earlier discussion, that the al-Nusra Front and al-Qaeda affiliate now looks like the kind of more moderate jihadists, if that's the kind of language we should use?
Well, I think it does. I mean, it has been said. I mean, Qatar is a potential ally. I mean, although its relations with the UAE are somewhat strained. I mean, Qatar is a potential ally. It does have influence with these groups, and now we're seeing. In fact, the al-Nusra Front for some days now has sort of been saying, well, look, if you'll pay us or something, or if you come to some kind of agreement over these people, and I think they are trying perhaps to say, look, we are the good guys in a sense, or at least the least bad guys, and when we are perhaps a potential ally against the Islamic State.
Do you think that could happen?
No, I don't think so. I think this distinction between Nusra and ISIS and Qaeda, it's probably a little more of a personal problem between the leaders of the various groups, because they are fighting over spoils of war. I don't think there are principles behind it. I think they will continue because they are fighting over the power. And if you are going to have a Khalifa, you're going to have one Khalifa. You can't have a Khalifa everywhere. So this is unlikely to happen. I think that this will continue to happen as long as there are people who are willing to look at those people as they are their allies against Assad, against Maliki, against the West. Whatever they dislike, then they will give them sanctuary. They will assist them. They hate them, but they are the lesser evil.
Well, also in the news, we were marking the 13th anniversary of the attack on the Twin Towers, and it was obviously a horrendous attack. But viewed from this point, viewed back 13 years, now that we know all that came out of that moment, it looks like the moment where the gates of hell were opened, doesn't it?
Yes, I think so. I think no one can underestimate the value of loss of people. 3,000 people, 3,000 innocent people were killed unnecessarily. But for states to react in the way it did, it was a terrorist organization. Qaeda did it. Saudis done the job, and Iraq gets burnt and destroyed. And this is where there were no Qaeda, there were no terrorism in Iraq. We had this dodgy dossier and the rest of all the things which everybody knows. But at the end of the day, people in the know, they knew this is not correct, whether it's in the US or whether in Britain in particular, because we were really in the vanguard with the Western alliance. So I think there was a dishonesty there. What worries me is that we are still practicing the same dishonesty with the new threat of ISIS.
Well, Professor Grove, do you think that's right, that there was always, and you know, people made this point at the time, that however horrendous that attack was, it was essentially a terrorist attack, and the pursuit of those people should have been, should have been a response on that level. Instead, we declared war against the terrorist organisation as if it were another state, and therefore we had to find other states to attack. And do you think that was the kind of besetting sin at the beginning of this?
I agree entirely. I think it was. I remember saying at the time, actually, that this was an example of what you might call sort of international urban guerrilla warfare, where you do something very, very outrageous in order to get your enemy to do something outrageous in return, to clamp down, to go over to the attack, and therefore create a situation which you can exploit. And that, in fact, is what's happened. I mean, the attack on Iraq, which had nothing to do with the attack on the Twin Towers, I mean, that has created a situation where we now have the possibility of a caliphate being set up in the northwestern part of the country, and where it has brought terrible hardships on the Iraqi people. I mean, I'm sure that more people have been killed in Iraq because of the results of the invasion than Saddam Hussein would ever have killed in his rather nasty and murderous regime. And, of course, it's created in places like Britain, for example, the perception that the Americans and the British are hostile to Islam, that they're crusaders. And this has led to things like the attack on the underground on 7/7, the murder of the soldier in the street, and so on. And it's created all the kinds of problems and tensions that Saddam Hussein could possibly have dreamt about. So, in fact, it has proved, very sadly, to be an enormous success for al-Qaeda.
Do you think that the al-Qaeda operation has been put in the shadow now by the rise of the Islamic State?
Actually, I'm one of the people who don't subscribe to this idea of this international organization, that you need NATO to fight it. Those are disaffected people. There is a policy which cannot be defended by ordinary people. So, of course, you get people who are defending their rights alongside with terrorists who are having a different agenda. But this is really the cause of the problem. I don't think Al-Qaeda is really such a major organization which has contacts and phoning people and sending messages. They don't have an airplane. They don't have, none of the state elements they have. Yet we are getting NATO, Security Council, the Europeans, we are having the Arabs getting involved, we are having the Jeddah meeting, we have all this to fight who when we don't know. This idea that you fight this invisible, war on terror, war on want, war on... It's really, this is a gimmick more than reality. I think the way it's addressed is to treat the cause rather than the symptoms.
Professor Grove, do you think there's an overestimation of the grip that that the Islamic State has on these areas? Because Sabah's made the point earlier that detaching them from the kind of support of the Sunni Rising is one way in which we could view the limitations of their support. But there was a rather interesting map published recently which showed their support to be around the main arteries, around the main roads, but not necessarily penetrating very far into the countryside around them. Do you share that analysis?
Yeah, I think we are seeing something rather different, though. I mean, Al-Qaeda was never really a top-down organization. I've been arguing for years it was a kind of inspiration, or possibly a franchise, but perhaps even more an inspiration to various local groups to engage in their various versions of what they interpreted as jihad in various places. I think there is something of a change, though, in what al-Baghdadi and the Islamic State are trying to do. It's one reason, I think, that they've fallen out with what's left of the Al-Qaeda high command, and that is that they are trying to set up a political organization. I mean, I have seen organization charts of the various parts of the Islamic State, and I think the tendency, which is shared by the Americans, in fact, rather to underestimate the administrative strength of this organization. They do seem to have a pretty effective organization that collects taxes. In other words, pay up or you get killed, which does have a sort of a hierarchy in various places, and that I think makes it rather different, in fact, from the traditional form of rather incoherent terrorism. I think this is a political organization. It is, even if you don't want to call it that, something approaching some kind of state, and I think it has to be addressed in those kinds.
Okay, well, just let me put that point to Sabah, because I mean, let's because that's a fair point. I mean, you made the point about how weak Al-Qaeda was in organisational terms. Now, we don't have to go as far as to say that the IS is actually a functioning state. It clearly isn't, but it is a more organised version of a terrorist organisation, isn't it?
Oh yes, definitely, because it's the only one which has control over areas. Now I know I have friends and relatives who live in Mosul. I speak to them regularly in ISIS land, and they tell me now at the present moment in the Department of Land Registry, in the education, in the health, in the various departments, you have an ISIS man who directs, this year we are not going to teach English or whatever. Other diktat in the education. In the health, they're going to segregate this, that, and that. So this is the first time they are in control of an administration. They don't, the people there who are working there are the ordinary people who have always worked there. But you have now this political officer who comes into the land registry, tell them what to do in the health and the education. So of course they do have this. But they have been collecting money from people for the last 10 years. It's not now. My friend in Mosul tells me that he used to pay 2 sets of people for the last 10 years to Al-Qaeda and to the Maliki police. Now he's paying only half. He's only paying for Al-Qaeda. So he's better off financially.
It's got a Tory tax cut then. OK, well, we're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. My thanks to Sabah Al-Muhktar here in the studio and to Professor Eric Grove on the line. But before we move on, let's have a look at what some of you lot have been saying on Twitter. Many people are tweeting about the 13th anniversary of the attack on the Twin Towers in New York that we've been talking about. Others have highlighted the fact that the day also marks 30 years since the United States backed the coup against President Salvador Allende of Chile. Dean Darko, for instance, says, RIP President Salvador Allende, who was massacred along with thousands of his supporters on the 11th of September 1973 in Santiago, Chile. As the Pistorius trial continues in South Africa, some Twitter users have taken to Twitter to demand greater respect for the victim. Shane Matthew Neve says, Riva deserves to be remembered, yet as history has shown, people who commit violent crimes develop notoriety. Meanwhile, the Egyptian media are reporting a further crackdown on civil liberties in that country. The Daily News newspaper in Egypt says tweeted, on-campus political activities banned by the education minister. Well, we've come to the end of this segment, but do join us for the final part of tonight's programme when we'll be looking at Israel's probe into its own military following the month-long Gaza offensive. That's after this break. Do rejoin us.